effective system of parole, which continues to throw people in jail for minor technical violations, even as the deadly COVID pandemic continues to rage behind bars. So I'd like to begin by speaking about someone named Raymond Rivera. In August of 2019, Raymond Rivera was arrested at his family home after leaving a residential drug treatment program and failing to check in with his parole officer. All things considered, this was an incredibly minor violation of the terms of his parole. It's not like Rivera, went out and committed a new crime or did something harmful. He left a program and went home. He didn't commit any new crime after his release. He'd already served over 4 years in prison for stealing bicycles and a motorcycle cover. Not the motorcycle, the cover. It's not like he was alleged to have posed a danger to anyone or to have been a threat. According to the New York Times, he'd been struggling with depression and addiction, and he experienced a relapse. But the repercussions for that action, for leaving the program and going home, were severe and immediate. After his arrest, Rivera was rushed directly to Rikers Island, where he spent 8 months on Rikers Island, waiting for the state of New York to resolve the matter of his missing a meeting. So as it turns out, those 8 months on Rikers Island would be the rest of Raymond Rivera's life. In April, he became one of the first 2 people to die in New York after contracting COVID-19 while incarcerated. The other man, Michael Tyson, had also been jailed on a minor technical violation of his parole. His was also for failing to report to his case officer. So both men missed a meeting, were awaiting the resolution of these charges, and died for it. The tragic deaths of Raymond Rivera and Michael Tyson were just the latest cases to expose the cruel and absurd nature of New York's parole system. These men should never have been in jail, and they wouldn't have been if not for the state's overly punitive supervision system, which pushes an incarceration-first approach for these minor technical violations of probation and parole. And this unnecessarily harsh process plays out thousands of times across the state of New York every year, where there are more than 35,000 people currently under supervision. That's roughly as many people as there are in all of the state prisons. And these people are actually just a tiny fraction of the 4.4 million people nationwide who are also under some form of supervision like probation or parole. For these folks, and I say just disclosing fully that I used to be a public defender, I've been a public defender in New York, and I've seen these minor slip-ups myself. These minor slip-ups can end with the state stripping people of their freedom and now exposing them to a deadly disease in the process. As if disrupting someone's entire life and putting them in a cage wasn't enough, now there's a risk of death. I will tell you frankly that as a public defender, when I walked into an arraignment booth and met my client for the first time and heard that they were there on a parole violation, my heart sank because I'd become all too familiar with dealing with this frustrating, inhumane, intransigent system that seemed designed to set people up to fail. So with that background in mind, I am especially glad today to have a chance to talk more about how broken these systems are in New York and across the United States with our guest, Alice Speri, a reporter at The Intercept, who recently published a story on this very issue. Alice, thank you so much for being with us on The Appeal Live today. So I want to start with your story. You wrote a story entitled "The Coronavirus Pandemic Has Exposed the Absurdities of New York's Parole System." And you were actually able to interview Raymond Rivera's partner. I'm showing a screen grab of your story right here. And I actually didn't get into all the detail that you were able to at the top of this show about Rivera's case and the 8 months spent on Rikers. I'd love for you to sort of fill us in a little bit more on what led up to his arrest and what happened to him while he was at Rikers.
Thank you much. Thank you so much, Emily, for having me. And as you said, Mr. Rivera was a 50-year-old man who had a history of depression and addiction. He was a family man. He lived with his partner and son. I actually got a chance to speak with both of them, and they were very much involved in his reentry and in his reintegration. They were very supportive of his attempts to deal with his addiction. And his partner actually told me that she was the one that would check on him all the time and make sure that he would go to his drug program, and that one day he just didn't tell her that he hadn't showed up, and she was so mad that he hadn't, because she felt that had she known, she could have intervened and really helped him. But just a day later, police showed up at his home while his son was there and arrested him over just that one failure to show up at the treatment program and to check in with his parole officer. And as you said, Mr. Rivera spent the next 8 months at Rikers. His case really dragged on. He had hearings that were scheduled. He was supposed to have a hearing in October, and then that was moved to later on. And then he had another one in March. And by the time he got his hearing, the pandemic was underway, and the situation at Rikers was really tragic already. You might remember Rikers was actually one of the first hotspots in the pandemic in the country. In the very early days of the pandemic, Mr. Rivera actually complained to his partner that the safety measures and precautions at Rikers were very lax, that people weren't wearing masks, that there just wasn't a lot of attention paid to the virus. And he then started experiencing flu-like symptoms. He went to the nurse at the jail, and the nurse basically thought he was fine. So he, went back for a few more days and got sicker and sicker. And ultimately he was hospitalized at Bellevue Hospital. And just then, after he was hospitalized and after his partner called attorneys and doctors and really got involved, that's when the Department of Corrections, which also runs the parole system, that's when they got involved. That's when the paperwork finally started moving. That's when the process, after 8 months, really moved along, and he actually got his release a day before he passed.
I wanted to talk about that, actually, because he was like dying in a hospital bed. And at that point, the state finally processed his release paperwork. Were they ever forced to explain that timing? Because it's just incredibly emotionally offensive.
They have not. And it is really just like such an insult almost, because what happened when his son later contacted Rikers, the warden, and contacted docs, he was told that Mr. Rivera's death did not happen in custody, which is true. It did not happen in custody because he had been released just a few hours earlier. So his death was not even counted as having happened, under in the system, which is just like horrifying. And to me, like the most heartbreaking detail of this, that Mr. Rivera actually got to hear that his paperwork had gone through. His son went into his room and told him, after all these months, you're free, you're a free man. And his partner actually was so proud to say that, he died a free man. He was not a prisoner, in her words, as when he died, which is just, really devastating to me. And what's interesting, Mr. Rivera, throughout the process, he himself had been trying to figure out why his case was stuck. There was no reason for the process to take this long. And, he would tell his son that you're just on their time. They're doing what they want to be doing. And I do want to say that his case was particularly tragic, and the length of his stay at Rikers was, unusual. But this kind of bureaucratic intransigence that is the whole parole system is not unique at all. I mean, there are constant hurdles and obstacles and paperwork and just things that don't make any kind of sense at all when you consider what the stated purpose of parole is, which is to help people reintegrate. The way the system works is just, not logical.
Yeah, I wanted to drill down on that for a second, because like you've got this initial thing that most people wouldn't care about, right? Which is a missed meeting. Like if you ask most people on the street, like, hey, does somebody else missing a meeting make you feel unsafe? They would be like, I don't care about other people's meetings. But it results in what you've described kind of as like indefinite detention for really, really minor misconduct. And I wonder if you could sort of walk us through some of the other cases you've seen where this indefinite detention thing happens.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, to explain how the parole system works for those that don't know, I mean, people can be charged with a parole violation mostly for two reasons, right? Either for committing a new crime, and then a good number of them for committing what is called a technical violation. And a technical violation means that there are no allegations of criminality whatsoever, but there was an alleged failure to abide by one of the conditions of a person's parole. And those conditions vary, but for the most part, violations are things like failing to check in with a parole officer, or failing to report a change of address or a change of job, or violating a curfew. That's a very common one. Or sometimes even just showing up for an appointment, depending on the relationship one builds with their parole officer. Little things that could be completely trivial in a different context end up costing somebody a violation. When a person is accused of violating the terms of their parole, they can have a warrant issued for their arrest. And just this year, in 2020, between January and October, when I got data from, there were 7,295 people in New York State who were arrested over a technical parole violation. So people are brought back to jail after having served their time upstate or where else, and they then get into this process that usually is supposed to last no more than about 100 days, but can sometimes drag much longer, as Mr. Rivera's case shows. They are supposed to get a preliminary appearance within 2 weeks, where usually a docs officer kind of like rubber stamps a parole officer's claim that the parole terms were violated, and then this person remains in custody without bail usually, until a final hearing can take place within 90 days before an administrative law judge, who then can decide to either revoke the parole and then resentence this person to additional time, or just let them go. And so even people who are let go in the end, like a good percentage of people, end up spending up to 3 months in jail waiting for their case to be adjudicated. And again, in technical parole violations, this is over things like missing curfew. So you can really see how the system is just like set up in a way that's not.
Yeah, let's sort of blow this out for a second, because what you're talking about it in the context of New York, but we know that this is also happening to those like 4.5 million people nationwide. Absolutely. Who are under the same kind of supervision. And what's kind of wild to me to think about is like, every time you throw somebody back into prison over like missing a meeting, if that person had a job, the job is gone. If that person had managed to attain housing, the housing is gone. If that person had been rebuilding a relationship with their children after years in prison, the relationship is broken. I mean, there's like so much harm that comes from that period of detention over a meeting. And I think the benefit to public safety, right, is like pretty negligible, because you're not like stopping a crime, you're punishing someone for a bureaucratic thing. So when we look at how much taxpayers are paying, billions of dollars each year for this cycle, I'm wondering, how have officials justified these practices to a tax base that should really be outraged by what their dollars are being used for?
I mean, that's exactly the absurdity of it. And I think what's so fascinating is like the supposed intention of the parole system. The whole point ostensibly has been to kind of transition, help people get this transition phase from the time they're incarcerated to the time when they're out, and kind of offer them services and a support system. And that's the theory of parole. That's what people kind of think about when they hear about parole. In reality, what it has become is this kind of backdoor incarceration system where basically, you're constantly threatened with the possibility of reincarceration. Often enough, you are reincarcerated over very minor things. And this is, as you said, extremely costly in terms of just public resources, but also so damaging and so harmful to the people who are trying to reintegrate into society and their families and their broader communities, because of course the damage is never just on the individual. But as you said, this is absolutely not a New York specific problem, although New York is faring much worse than most other states. In fact, it is second to only Illinois in terms of the rate of people it reincarcerates on technical parole violations. And what's interesting in New York is that, the state has successfully decarcerated over the years. The overall prison population is declining. And so the fact that so many people on parole in New York are reincarcerated is kind of like contrary to trends that, supposedly our state officials are trying to change. Right now in New York, there are 35,000 people in state prisons, and then another 35,000 under supervision. It costs about $600 million a year just in New York State. The figure for the country is about $2.8 billion annually. And right now, technical parole violations make up basically a third of all prisons admissions in New York State. So you really see.
Wait a minute. I don't want to just breeze past that stat, because I didn't know that, and I want. Let's grind to a halt.
Technical parole violations are a third of all prison admissions to New York State.
A third of people going into prison in New York are going because of things like missed meetings and unpaid fines.
Exactly.
To prison, and, prison, a place where you stay for more than a year. Prison.
Yeah, upstate. I mean, So, and that, that's without counting the people who are incarcerated at Rikers, while they wait their parole adjudication process to, the 90 days I was speaking about earlier, while they figure out, whether they're going to be reincarcerated or not. And that doesn't even begin to get into the racial disparities of it all, which of course are stark. Just like to throw some numbers there, Black New Yorkers are between 50 and 100% more likely to be charged with parole violations. Black and Latino New Yorkers remain under supervision much longer than white New Yorkers, and they end up at Rikers over parole violations at 12 Black New Yorkers and 4 Latino New Yorkers, 4 times the rate, respectively, of white New Yorkers. So just to kind of give you, we know the criminal justice system broadly is just like ridden by this kind of disparities, but these are just like
more likely to be picked up on a parole violation, more likely to be found culpable for a parole violation, and then more likely, you said, to serve more time on that same violation.
Absolutely.
So, and also when we put this in the COVID context, more likely to experience really severe consequences from COVID infection. So when you put someone in a COVID hotspot, I want to go back to the question of like putting the pressure on parole officials to justify this, because to me, when you said that stat about a third of new prison admissions being from technical violations with no new crime, what stood out to me was this is a moment when activists, and not just activists, but like reasonable experts and medical professionals, have been begging Governor Cuomo to find ways to diminish the number of people who are locked in prisons and jails because they are at such high risk of COVID, and they're creating a hotspot that infects the whole surrounding community. So what I'm wondering is, like, knowing those numbers and knowing that so many people are going upstate just for technical violations, has any official, whether it's in Cuomo's office or in docs or parole, had to really justify their behavior on this? Have they been held to account?
That's what's really fascinating, is everyone seems to agree that this just doesn't make sense and the system is broken and needs reforming. Now, when I spoke with docs, with the Department of Corrections, they were very defensive, and they said that the number of people held on parole has decreased over the years, which it has, although it is still extremely high, and the proportion of people that are reincarcerated over parole violations is far too high. But yes, the overall number has decreased. But in terms of officials, across the state, we've had from Governor Cuomo to Mayor de Blasio to the entire New York City Council to, the Manhattan, Bronx, and Brooklyn DAs coming out in support of pretty sweeping parole reform legislation that's currently on the table in Albany. And so there's quite a bit of movement that's being built right now around this new bill, the Less is More Act, which is actually not a new bill. It was introduced a couple of years ago, but there's kind of renewed momentum around it right now. And the bill would essentially eliminate incarceration for most technical parole violations, and then cap at 30 days incarceration for all other serious violations. And then it would kind of speed up the whole process, allow people to see a judge sooner, allow them to ask to be released in the community while they wait the whole case to be adjudicated. And it would also give them an incentive, basically giving people earned credit time after parole. So for every 30 days without police contact, then they would get 30 days after overall parole time. So it's all this kind of like very common sense, very logical things that would like completely overhaul the system as we have it. And there is just like such mass support of this bill. It's really been endorsed by like former probation officials, current prosecutors, a number of elected officials across the state. It just hasn't passed yet. And I think a lot of people are worried that there's a certain level of kind of criminal justice fatigue in Albany right now, particularly after the bail reforms kind of drama last year and the very fierce pushback against those, even though that was not very much based in data at all. And so I think there's been some concern that that's something that is just so logical and has kind of like broad support as the Less is More Act might sort of not get the attention it needs because of that. But a lot of people are working to make sure that bill passes. And I think we're going to see a lot more talk about it in the next months, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially at a moment where lives are on the line. There may be subject matter fatigue in Albany, but like, I don't really care if my loved one is going to die because of some lawmaker's fatigue.
And we're well into the second wave of the pandemic. We know that the number of cases in prisons is rising really fast. The number of deaths in New York prisons is rising. And here we are with something that's just like so simple and so obvious, and it is like so absurd that so many people are in prison right now over technical parole violations. So you would think that this is the kind of thing that would be prioritized.
Well, Alicia, it's 2021. I'm putting my eggs in the basket of things that need to be prioritized, finally getting prioritized. So as you said, we're going to be hearing a lot more conversation about the Less is More Act. I hope a lot more reporting on the Less is More Act and some attention to it, movement on it, lives saved by it. Thank you so much for coming here and telling us about it and giving us, it's so rare that someone comes on the show and like really schools me in a way where I am visibly surprised in front of an audience. So thank you so much for that. That was awesome.
I learned a lot talking to people about this. That's what's so fascinating, I think, about the parole system is this sort of like invisible bureaucracy that's maybe like less, obviously violent to people because it's just like not something that we talk about all the time. It's not something that we see. It's, people that have already served a lot of time. There just isn't a lot of talk about it. And when you look at how the system works, it's just like, cruel, stupid bureaucracy. I don't even know if there's time, but like I wrote about a couple guys and a story was really heartbreaking to me. This father of 5 who was incarcerated on technical parole violation in October, and the judge actually agreed to release him if he agreed to participate in a program. And then the jail staff at Rikers didn't produce him on the phone. They actually did not take him to the phone booth on the day that he was supposed to call in on his release hearing. And so he wasn't released. And the judge adjourned the hearing to after Christmas. And so this is the kind of thing that, really is just completely logical.
And it's not outliers. Like what you're talking about, to anybody who's worked inside the system, you're like, oh yeah, that happens every day, where someone stays in jail for an extra 2 months because a correctional officer refused to bring them to a booth.
It's an absurd obstacle.
That's what's so great. I'm gonna do a little plug for our Appeal Live show, because this is the place where people can come to hear about incredibly stupid things that are actually easy to fix, but if we don't fix, they're going to kill people. This is a great place for that. So thank you so much.
I'm glad you guys are there.
I'm glad we're here too. I'm glad you're here with us. For folks who are interested, you can follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, at The Appeal, or at The Appeal News. I'm Emily Gavin Almanza. I'm thanking Alicia Speri again for joining us. You can see us again here, same time, same place, tomorrow and most days. We look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.